Is writing multiple books in the same best-selling world genius, or is it a commercial sellout? I want to ask that question today, and I want us to have a look and discuss the topic of writing similar books in the same world a significant number of years after a commercially successful series. And to do that, to kind of help us work our way through the question, I'm going to be looking at the Hunger Games series by Suzanne Collins. So this is something that I've been thinking about a lot recently. Book Talk and other social media have made us question authors revisiting similar books, similar series, similar successes many years later. And I wanted to look at The Hunger Games specifically because Suzanne Collins initially released her Hunger Games trilogy from 2008 to 2010 and then took a decade gap before returning to it with the publication of The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes in 2020 and Sunrise on the Reaping, which was published this year. I've seen quite a few people asking, would Suzanne Collins really have returned to this series if the initial trilogy hadn't been so hugely successful? So I want to get into it really. I want to explore that. So I did a little bit of research. I had a look and thought, well, what other authors have returned to a series many years after a commercial success? One of the more controversial examples that I came across was E.L. James's series 50 Shades of Grey. The initial series was a fan fiction of Twilight, and whether you love it, whether you hate it, it did very well commercially. It was a huge success, which then spawned the 3 films. So the huge success of these books and the success of the films did lead E.L. James to create another trilogy of books, a mirror in effect. These were called Grey, Darker and Freed. I had to think about it then for a second. She took the initial titles and she changed them slightly. And she wrote the exact same story again, but from Christian Grey's perspective. This made me think, is this something that she always planned? Was it always part of her strategy to release the same books from the other perspective? Or was it a way to capitalise on the popularity? She didn't release the first of Christian's version. Just realised that. Christian's version, like Taylor's version. She didn't release the first of Christian's version until after the films had come out. Once she'd seen the success, once the success had happened. I don't know, maybe it was always part of her plan, maybe it was a way to capitalise on the popularity. Perhaps a slightly less controversial and personally very welcome example is the news that children's author Jacqueline Wilson is planning to revisit many of the books and characters from her hugely popular books such as The Story of Tracy Beaker, The Suitcase Kid, The Lottie Project, all of those childhood books that we so loved and that so many millennials have got really fond memories of. She's going to write a follow-up book basically about each of the characters and where they are now as adults. I personally absolutely love this concept, and I know that when I reviewed the Girls series in one of my previous videos, I was a little bit disappointed with the results. I still stand by that. I think that book could have been epic and it maybe missed the mark in a couple of places, but I loved the concept. And I think this idea of her revisiting characters that were children when we initially read them and now revisiting them as adults and us being able to again relate to them as adults in their experiences, I think is absolutely genius. I'm actually looking forward to reading more of these as they come out. So those are very recent examples, but would you be surprised if I told you that writing books in the same world but with a significant gap between isn't just a new phenomenon? Arthur Conan Doyle killed off Sherlock Holmes in one of his books, only to realise that he wanted to write more of his story, so he had to write a prequel book. That was actually Hound of the Baskervilles, simply so that he could bring Sherlock Holmes back into the plotline. Agatha Christie took a massive break from writing her Poirot series to write Miss Marple, and then she came back to it again many years later. And my personal favourite, being an absolute Lord of the Rings nerd, did you know that there are actually 17 years between the publication of Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit? Tolkien took 17 years off in between and still managed to come back and write a prequel book that was absolutely phenomenal and expanded the world even more. So it's always happened. So why is it being questioned now? The emergence of BookTok and AI, not to mention influencer book deals, is actually making many readers question whether returning to worlds and characters is a decision led by author passion or if it's a commercial decision from a publisher. Regardless of the reasons, fans are absolutely lapping it up. They're thrilled to have new books in their favourite fictional worlds, and I'm one of them. The familiarity of a world or character means that starting the book is less of a gamble for readers because they believe they'll enjoy this book as much as they did the last. They're also really invested in the characters. A good book leaves you wanting more of a character's life or world. So in many ways, authors are simply giving readers what they say they want, aren't they? Now, you know that I'm always very open about my bookish opinions. I can't help it. If my words don't give me away, my face will. So I have no choice but to be honest in these videos. Personally, I can imagine that for a publisher, it's going to make commercial sense to publish a book that already has an established readership. Like, for me, it just makes business sense. I think there's been that a sort of nose up at publishers recently for making decisions that appear on the surface to be only about making money. Firstly, if publishers don't make money, then there's going to be no more publishers. Like, we need publishers to make money so that they can continue to publish books. Secondly, publishing guaranteed commercially successful books actually means that publishers can then afford to take more of a risk on new writers or more niche projects, things that aren't necessarily going to get them that huge financial windfall. I actually don't mind it when an author writes a novel that expands on a previous world. I actually think it's genius in many ways. I think it's really good for the readers. I think it's good for the authors' careers. You know, you're thinking about a writer, they have to set out a set number of books over their career in order to be able to afford to live, to be able to continue to write. And so it makes sense from a commercial, from a career perspective, that an author would write new things that take more time and more brain power and then maybe revisit things and go back to old worlds which don't take as much setup time, creative energy, etc. That's not to be negative about books that are written in old worlds. I'm not saying that it's a cop-out or anything like that. I just think it makes sense from a career perspective. And there's lots of different reasons why they might want to do it. My only concern would be making sure that the authors actually enjoy doing that. Do they want to revisit those old books? Is it something that they would like to do and that they've always thought, oh, I'd love to go back to that? Has Jacqueline Wilson always wanted to go back and revisit those stories? Or is it something that they are being pushed to do by their publishers, by their agents, by somebody who has more of a mind on numbers, if you know what I mean? I also could totally understand if authors just wanted to write something new every time. I'm going through my own story at the moment of trying to write my first novel, and I'm at the editing stage. I've written this book, I've read it a couple of times now, and I'm already getting to the point where I'm like, I love this and I'm enjoying the writing process, but I'm ready for the next thing. So I can understand if authors do get a little bit fed up of writing the same characters in the same world after a set period of time and want to do something new. So personally, I think I'd be happy with the balance. So for example, with TheHungerGames, which I will come on to talk about properly in a minute, but I think there's so much mileage for more books in this world. And I would be totally fine if Suzanne Collins said, look, I get it. I get that you want more books from me in the Hunger Games series, but I can't do them back to back. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go away, I'm going to write one Hunger Games book, and then I'm going to disappear for a couple of years. I'm going to write something new, I'm going to explore, I'm going to stretch my creative legs, and then I'll come back again in another few years and we'll have another one. And just do that. Like, I would totally understand that. Commercially, it makes sense because that publisher, that agent knows that every few years there is going to be a commercially successful book coming from that author. But it also allows for that author to do the creativity, to do the creating, to build the world, to come up with new people and new stories, which ultimately is why we write. And I just wanted to back that up actually with one more case study, which is that Ken Follett, the writer of the Kingsbridge series, which I absolutely love. The first book in the series is called Pillars of the Earth, and that book kind of just defines my late teen years. I absolutely loved it. I still love it now. That was published in 1989, the year after I was born, and the latest book in the series of 5 books was published in 2023. That's 34 years for 5 books. That means that Ken Follett has taken almost my entire lifetime just to write those 5 books in the series. But he wasn't only writing those 5 books, and this is my point. He was going away, he was writing lots of other things, other series, other standalone novels. He was flexing whilst he was developing that Kingsbridge series. So there's no reason why that isn't something that authors could do. Have the commercial success of revisiting previous worlds, but also have the creative freedom to be able to come up with whatever they want in the meantime. Now that we've kind of done an overview of the topic and I've introduced kind of the question and why I wanted to look into it, I thought we'd have a look at The Hunger Games itself. I wanted to kind of deep dive into an example. So I purposefully reread the whole trilogy and then the 2 more recent books back to back over the course of a few weeks so that my thoughts and opinions on all of the books are completely fresh in my mind. I read them all together so that I could get a comparative view from book to book and across the storylines as well. So if you're not familiar with The Hunger Games, I don't know how you wouldn't be. Pretty much everybody knows about The Hunger Games, either from reading the books or seeing the films. But let's assume that maybe you don't know anything about the books. They follow a main character called Katniss Everdeen, and she is a 16-year-old girl who is chosen to represent her district, one of 12, in their annual Hunger Games. This is a televised competition that sees 24 children, 2 from each district, fight to the death to become a victor. A victor. The sole survivor of the games wins a life of luxury and they get to return to their district whilst all the other children do not. It's a really brilliant concept actually, The Hunger Games. It's very simple in style, but it allows for lots of complexity along the way. It questions politics, it questions personal relationships, it questions loss, it questions war, all of those different types of things. If you've not read it, then I highly recommend that you do. To be honest, the second half of this video is going to be talking about the books. I'm not going to be summarising each individual book, but we're going to be discussing the series as a whole. And yes, there are going to be spoiler alerts. So to be honest, if you've not read the books yet, I recommend that you kind of stop this video now, go away, take a few weeks to read the books, and then maybe come back and watch again, because I think it'll mean a lot more to you at that point. So I can't remember how old I was when I first read The Hunger Games. The first book came out in 2008, and I would have been in the second year of university, so I'd have been kind of 19, 20. So I definitely know I read them before I watched the films. But like I say, I can't remember exactly when. I was a little bit older than Katniss. Like I say, at the beginning of the first book, she's 16, and I was probably 19, 20 when I read the books. But there wasn't really that much difference, and I definitely identified with her. I loved her story, and as a younger reader, I feel like I focused more on her and her story, and I was less kind of tuned into some of the secondary peripheral characters. But this time around when I read it, I really appreciated the complexity of the plot, the characters, and the world building. I think even as an adult, I found a lot to enjoy in the series, and so I don't necessarily think it should be billed as just a YA series anymore. I actually enjoyed reading it probably more this time around because I got more out of the peripheral characters. People like Haymitch, Effie Trinket, Plutarch Heavensby, and even Katniss's mother, I had a lot more sympathy for her this time around. So it's hard to read... God, that came out very Yorkshire. It's hard to revisit books you loved as a child or a younger adult because you kind of worry that the magic won't be the same. But I was really relieved to find that when I reread the initial 3 books, I had such a deeper experience and I still really, really loved it. So I'm not going to talk about those 3. I feel like we know those stories. So when I heard there were 2 further books, I was like, what are they going to be about? What are they going to be about? Because the series came to an end, like a very, very definite end. And then I heard that it was prequels, and all of a sudden my mind was just like, pooh, because I was like, oh, yes, I get it. There's so much scope for prequel content with this series. So that's kind of how I went into reading Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, which for some reason I cannot get in my head. The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. I've called it all sorts whilst I've been reading this series and I've been talking about it to friends and family. I'm just going to call it Ballad because for me and whatever's going on in my brain, that seems to work better. So Ballad, let's talk about that one. Now I thought that the 2 prequel books, that's kind of how I'm going to refer to them. I'm going to refer to the trilogy, I'm going to refer to the 2 prequel books. Hope that's okay and that makes it very clear what they are. I think that Ballad was actually my favourite of the two prequel books. Very, very close competition though, because they were both absolutely brilliant. And I think what I loved so much about Ballad was getting to know Snow more. I thought this was such a clever idea of Suzanne Collins, not just to jump straight into the stories of other victors, but instantly, let's give us the villain's origin story. Very clever. I think it makes you question everything. You know, you go from the end of the trilogy, especially if you read it in the order like I did, you get to the end of the trilogy, you're like, yes, Snow's dead, everything's back to normal, there's peace, and then suddenly you start the next book and you see another victim, but suddenly that victim is the villain that you know from the previous story. So clever. It made you question everything. And I loved hearing about Snow's childhood, his education, how Panem had developed after what they called the rebellion. It allowed me as a reader to see really small moments in Snow's life that would go on to impact who he would become in the actual later trilogy that we read. I really thought it was genius that it was his suggestion to introduce new things, to improve the games, aspects that are accepted as standard in the trilogy, but are introduced in the Ballad book. Things like the tributes being given really luxurious lodgings and food, the ability to bet on tributes and send gifts into the arena, and lots of other things that we see him developing those ideas. We do see Snow's conflict between being repelled by what's happening in terms of the games. Game maker Gaul, who is really clever, I'll talk about her more in a minute, but he's repelled by her actions, but he's also kind of intrigued by them at the same time. He's drawn into that kind of cause and effect. He likes to see the effect of his actions, even if he's simultaneously repelled by them at the same time. And I thought that it was really clever of Collins to split the kind of villainous character in this book between Gaul and Highbottom. I think, obviously, you always need a villain in a story like this, and I think if it had been a single villain, then we might have kind of lost something along the way. I'm not sure exactly what, but I do know that I think it was really clever to split these into two, and I think it's for a very specific reason. I think, this is just my own personal opinion, might not be at all what Suzanne Collins was intending, but I think that Highbottom represents the kind of human ability to be cruel, the part of Snow that we see in that main trilogy, but probably the part of him that's like redeemable, the things that are human failings. Whereas I think the character of Gaul is more of like a psychopathic villain. She's able to do like really heinous acts in the books, like, I can't remember the name of his friend who's turned into like a mutt, and she's experimenting on humans and all this kind of thing. That's real villain, psychopathic, heinous acts that don't have any humanity in them. And I think we see that aspect of Snow again later on in the trilogy. And so I really liked the fact that Suzanne Collins really delved into these aspects of Snow's personality, and each of those kind of aspects of his, or facets of his personality, were given an origin villain in a way, if that makes sense. And so we were able to really kind of question that side of his personality more and where it came from. But I loved how much throughout this book we were kind of told about the connection between Lucy Gray and Katniss, and how Katniss is kind of related to or somehow involved with the Covey. It's not entirely clear in Ballad, but we do get more of that in the second book, which I'll come on to talk about in a minute. But I just love the moment when Lucy Gray starts singing the Hanging Tree song. My mouth literally dropped open, and I'm not figuratively, literally. I was like, oh my God, that is amazing, because it's such a simple thing that Lucy Gray's singing. You go, oh, Katniss knew that song. Oh, it's a District 12 song. But then you instantly start going, that's why Snow hated it when Katniss sang it. That's why President Snow was so triggered by Katniss, because it weaves in that kind of the relationship that Snow had with Lucy and his love for her and her death and all that kind of thing. It helps to really so cleverly reinforce his actions in a book that chronologically comes later but was actually written earlier. Again, very, very clever. And in terms of the plot and events of the book, I think it was a really clever move to have two distinct parts to the book. The first half is in the capital and the second half is in District 12. And I think that was really clever because it allowed us to not only see Snow within the sphere of the capital. We'd seen him in the capital as in the trilogy, he was very much capital president, but I think it was really good to kind of take him away from that setting. To see Snow outside of the capital, I think was really important for us in understanding, again, his character development. So with the plotting, again, I was thinking all the way through, I was like, there is no female District 12 victor. Like, we know this from the original trilogy, that's what we're told, it's only Haymitch. And so that's why Haymitch is the only mentor that's available to Katniss and Peter. So I was like, well, Lucy's going to die in the Hunger Games. And I had that in my mind all the way through. And when it didn't happen and she was named Victor, I was like, what? What's going on? But then I realised that this is all going to be part of Snow's character development. I was like, there's a reason for this. We know that he's a cruel president by the time that Katniss is born. But in the first half of the book, we really sympathise with him. We're almost rooting for him, actually. And so when he's accused of being a cheater in the Hunger Games and he signs up to become a peacemaker, it was a bit of a jolt in the story. I'd had this kind of, well, Lucy's won the Hunger Games, what's going on? And then all of a sudden, we're back in District 12 and I was like, oh, this is really weird. I didn't like it at first. I kind of sat there with the book and I was like, oh, that's not what I wanted. But then once I gave myself time to think about it, I actually think it was really, really clever. I can see why we're doing this. We're seeing Snow out of his original kind of setting. It's giving a chance to see who he's going to become when actually the control around him is taken away a little bit. And I know he's a peacemaker. He's very much regimented. It's a bit like being in the armed forces. But at the same time, he had this sudden freedom to be able to be who he wanted to be. But I was also a little bit confused because he suddenly managed to meet up with Lucy again and they rekindled their romance, and I was like, where's the disintegration of Snow? When's he going to become a villain? I was kind of missing that, and I think that's a bit of a reason why I didn't love the second half as much as I loved the first half of the book. I think it was down to pacing, to be honest. I feel like in the first half of the book it was quite a lengthy introduction to Panem, the capital, at that time. I feel like in the second half the pace just went a bit too fast for me. I feel like it was a little bit rushed. I feel like they could have spent just as much time on the events in District 12, slowed it down, had more kind of contemplative events going on. And I do feel like that was a little bit of a missed opportunity to see Snow's character slowly disintegrate from the moment he got to 12. I feel like it would have been better if it had been really repulsed by his new station, by his job, that his snobbery could have come out more. He could have been really prejudiced against the people of 12. And instead, it was a little bit more moralistic for me. He was almost willing to risk everything for Lucy. He felt a little bit rebellious almost. And I was a bit like, I wanted more. Maybe I just wanted it to be a little bit more obvious. Just this kind of slow degradation into evil. That sounds very dramatic. I am aware that sounds very dramatic, but that's kind of what I wanted a little bit. Do see his betrayal of Sejanus and the killing of Mayfair and Billy, but again, all of these actions feel like Snow takes when he's like backed into a corner. The only true Snow action that we would recognise, having read the first 3 books, is when he actually turns on Lucy at the end of the book. And again, I just feel like that happened in a bit of a split second. In fact, I actually had to read the section 2 or 3 times to make sure that I was actually reading it correctly, because I was like, what? Where's this come from? Like, it just didn't feel like there was enough setup for it. It just felt like all of a sudden he was willing to risk or run away with it, and then he was like, nah, actually, you're too much of a liability. I just didn't get that kind of flick. I didn't get that change. Now, it might be that Collins is actually planning to return to Snow's character in a later book to show how he goes from that action to becoming the evil kind of capital president. Maybe that's where we see his degradation, and that actually by the end of Ballad he's still that young moralistic character, because we know that he gets pardoned, he goes back to the capital, he becomes a student at the university, and then obviously we do know he eventually goes on to become president of Panem. But it didn't feel like there was this kind of this side of him that was going to become so cruel and so lacking in humanity by the time we got to the end book. But to be honest, that was my only negative with that book. I absolutely loved it. I thought it was fantastic. It expanded the world brilliantly, and I loved all of the little Easter eggs and the weaving together of the 2 stories. So, Let's go on to Sunrise on the Reaping. Now, maybe because I read all 5 books back to back, but I'm going to be honest, by the time I got to this one, I was feeling a little bit fatigued with the format. I thought that, the young characters set up an introduction, then they get reaped, then they go to the training and assessment centre, then they go into the games, people slowly die off, and then the winner goes home. I was a bit like, do I want that? Can we see the games without having to go into the games? I was just a bit like, I'm not sure if this is what I want. But actually, I think now with a little bit of perspective of being able to kind of look back on it, I do think it was brilliant and I think it was fine. I think it was purely and simply down to the fact that I read all 5 books back to back. So this book itself is about Haymitch and it's Haymitch's backstory. And I wondered if Haymitch's story was going to be different, if it was going to be more about him or after he'd won the games but before he mentored Katniss and Peter. I know now that wouldn't have been possible because he basically just spent 25 years getting drunk and trying to cover up his trauma. So I see now why we couldn't get more of that side of him. And I see now why we needed his story in the games. And we did get to see this, but I do think there would have been an opportunity to slightly play around with the format a little bit. That being said, this book almost broke me at the end, and it takes a lot to make me cry when I'm reading. I don't think I've ever read a book that's actually properly made me cry. Hamnet was the closest I've come recently to getting really emotional. When I read that choked me up, did that book. And I am seriously worried about watching the film. But this book, at the end, when Haymitch goes home and all of the horrible things happen, I was absolutely heartbroken for him because I knew that he was on his own. I knew he's on his own by the time the original trilogy starts. But you're kind of hoping all the way through that it's going to be a different turnout. You're kind of praying and hoping. And then when all of it happens and he loses Lenore Dove and his family, it's just absolutely heartbreaking. Adding to that, the fact that Suzanne Collins' writing throughout the entire book is just as immersive and evocative as all of her other 4 books. I just thought, again, it was another absolutely stellar book. So in terms of the plot, like I say, it's very much back to the roots of the original Hunger Games, giving us the same plot structures. And while, like I say, I was a little bit fatigued, it's been a while now since I read these. There's been some personal reasons why I've not been able to record this video before now. And with some distance, I can actually see why Collins chose to do this format. And I actually do now think that it was a good choice. I think it gives us the familiarity of the initial series, especially after going so different with Snow's story. It allows us to compare Haymitch's experience with both Snow's time as a mentor, but also with the Tribute's experience of the games as well. We can see how the games have developed since Snow's time. Tributes are housed at a dedicated centre rather than kept in cages. But there's not quite the opulence of private bedrooms as there is by the time Katniss is there. So I love the kind of the juxtaposition and the growth that you get even in these really small elements of the story. I love the description of the arena. I really loved this arena, and all the things that happen while Haymitch is in the arena are just so clever. I don't have time to go into the full storyline, but I thought that was like a real testament to Collins' imagination and skill, that this is her, 4th arena that she's created throughout these books, and she's still able to make it so unique, so visually clear, and so different from all of the other arenas that we've had. So in terms of the characterisation, I love the fact that we know Haymitch already. I think that's why I like these kind of prequel books, because you're still familiar with the characters, but you're getting to know aspects of their story that we've not read before. And so we get to compare his character in this book to his character in the main trilogy. And again, that's another reason why books written in the same world can be so brilliant. I feel like I'm a little bit of a broken record at this point, because I just think it's great. We know that Haymitch is alone and alcoholic and covering up his trauma by the time we're in the main trilogy. And so there's that expectation hanging over you the entire time of what's it going to be? What's that trauma going to be? And when's it going to happen? And again, I love the fact that Collins took this opportunity to introduce another Covey character in Lenore Dove, but I think it was a really wise decision to not have her as a main character as she did with Lucy Greybeard. I think it would have been too on the nose, and I think it would have mirrored Ballard maybe a little bit too much. So I think that was the right decision. But again, it threaded Katniss throughout the entire books, and it explained why Haymitch seemed to be kind of so triggered by Katniss, but also how he seemed to identify so much with her. You know, she's this person who's been forced through a rebellion because the events of the games are completely out of her hands, and he's had the same experience through his own games, through being encouraged to rebel against the Capitol. And you can just, it makes the whole their relationship in the trilogy, it just makes it so much deeper, and I understand it a lot more now, having read Sunrise on the Reaping. Forgot the name of the book then. I love all of the little weaving together of the storylines. And I really like that we get to see a snippet of Snow again at this point. But at this point, he's already president, and he's already more like the Snow in the trilogy than he is in the Snow in Ballad. But I really loved being able to see a little bit of Snow in that, because again, it's just the weaving. There's then Haymitch's rebellion within this particular book, within Sunrise, but it kind of, for me, it helped me understand why the people of Panem were so quick to rise to the rebellion in the original trilogy. I think that's something that had always kind of sat at the back of my mind, was why now? Why Katniss? Why is that the thing? Why is that the moment that really starts to, you know, everybody gets behind it, everybody's ready? And I think these two books, Ballad and Sunrise, they both help to kind of show that it's never just been Katniss, it's always been something that people have tried to do. There's always been these rebellions, there's always been this pushback, there's always been this sense of humanity being horrified by the act of the Hunger Games. And I think that was really clever as well for Suzanne Collins to give us that depth of the storyline and the reasons for what happens in the trilogy. I loved that we got to meet Burdock Everdeen, Katniss's father. Again, I'm glad that Collins kept him as a relatively peripheral character, but I think it adds to the world so much and the people, and it creates the threads. Again, I'm sounding like a broken record, I'm just saying the same things over and over again, but it just weaves everything together so cleverly. I liked the fact that Maisie Donner, who, her character, absolutely loved her, just loved how strong she was as a female character, but she's the owner of the original Mockingjay pin, and it's just so clever, you know, adding Beatty in, but again as a peripheral character. It's his son that's in the arena. Just means that we get all these wonderful backstories without needing the entire book dedicated to each individual person. It means that we can kind of, everything's been neatly folded like a little pie. It's all been neatly folded and crafted together, and I think that's probably my main point about the Hunger Games series and why I wanted to use it as a case study for this video, because it's an outstanding example of how to do it right. Collins is creating new stories whilst also expanding on characters that we already know and taking the time to really thread everything and everyone together. Again, not wishing to be negative, but I've done other reviews where other books revisit stories and characters from a long time. And in that book, in that series, in the video that I made, I pointed out some really fundamental errors in those books that were incorrect. I do believe a lot of them have now been corrected in subsequent reprints, but it just really broke the immersion for me, and it spoke to a little bit of a lack of care in the development of that follow-up book. Whereas in the Hunger Games series, Collins and presumably her team of editors have worked really hard to ensure continuity across all of the books so that we can completely re-immerse ourselves in Panem, even though there's been a decade between the two kind of series, between the trilogy and the two follow-up books. It just makes you so excited when you see the Easter eggs and you go, oh gosh, yes, that weaves and that weaves. And, you know, I was I was messaging my friends and being like, oh my God, this moment. And they're like, I know, it's so cool, right? That's exactly the reaction that you want when you rewrite a book or you write a book from the same world many years later. You want to capture that excitement again still. So I do understand that Collins probably wants a break from the Hunger Games for now, and somebody asked her, I can't remember where I saw it on the internet, but there was somewhere where she was asked whether she would do any more, and she was like, I don't think so. But then I've also read a few blogs online of people who have said, well, you know, she did 3 original, there'll be 3 follow-ups because the number 3 is so big and so important in the Hunger Games. Who knows? I personally don't doubt that she'll come back to it. I think she really will come back to the series, whether it's from a creative standpoint, wanting to wrap up stories, if she's already got those in her mind, or just from a purely commercial perspective. I think it's a really beautiful world. It's rich for more stories. You know, I want Joanna Mason's story. I want Finnick's story. And I think there's so much scope for further narratives. You know, I didn't mention Tigris, but in Ballad, we meet Tigris as Snow's kind of cousin. She's really bold, she's affectionate, she's this warm, wonderful character. But then we don't hear any more of her until the Mockingjay book, where she's this character. It's almost she's had so much cosmetic surgery she looks like a cat, and she's helping the resistance of all things, but she's related to Snow. So what's happened? Where has she gone to that's put her at that position? And Effie, got so much I could talk about. I'm sorry, I'm talking so much. There is so much I could talk about with this series, but Effie Trinket's being kind of woven into the story as well in Sunrise, and Haymitch, when he first gets to meet Effie Trinket. I loved that moment as well. So what do you think? I'm going to shut up now because I've done a lot of talking. But what do you think? Do you think that we should or should not get more books in the same world? And what did you think about my specific example with the Hunger Games? Did I manage to capture everything that you were thinking about? Or is there another example that you think either supports this story, that I personally think it's a really good idea? Or are there some examples where you're like, no, clearly this example shows it's a horrible idea to go back to a previous series? I'm probably not going to do any video content around Ballad, the adaptation, but as and when Sunrise on the Reaping, because I know they have secured the film rights for Sunrise on the Reaping, so at that point, when that comes out and we get a trailer, which probably will be a couple of years from now, I might do a reaction to that film, either the trailer or the film or both. I mean, kind of look back over the adaptation of the whole Hunger Games series at that point. If you've got to this point, why don't you put a bow and arrow in the comments? I think there's a bow and arrow emoji. If there's not, I'm pretty sure there is, but if there's no bow and arrow emoji, then find something else. Find something else in the emojis that you think represents the Hunger Games and pop it into the comment section, and then I'll know which ones of you are teacher's pet and have got to this point in the video. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed this kind of more talky, discussion-based video where we kind of deep dive into a topic. I do these every now and again on my channel, so I hope you really enjoy it. You can find more on my channel in my content, and I'll see you in my next one.